Only 9% of businesses ever achieve revenue of $1 million. That's at 9%. So if you are already there, you are already in the top 10%. And most of these businesses stay under seven figures because they never quite figure out how to scale profitably. And this is a question that I always get, especially as a profit first professional, is how do I scale on profit first, right? How do I scale on profit first? And how do I scale while continuing to reach my target percentage allocations? And today's topic that we're going to talk about today is the topic of scaling, right? So becoming that business where it really no longer depends on you, right? It's going to be about scaling and scaling properly. And you have to do that strategically. And so this is always one of my favorite topics, one of my most interesting topics that I love talking about. And ironically, it's also a topic that a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with, right? They struggle with this. And I'll tell you this, I will say 90% of the world never overcomes this. And that's the reason why so many businesses stay under $1 million in revenue. Do you guys know how many businesses from a percentage standpoint actually achieve $1 million in revenue? How many businesses out there ever go on to become seven-figure businesses? Well, there was a study that was conducted in 2018, and only 9% of small businesses ever gross revenue in excess of $1 million. Only 9% of businesses ever achieve revenue of $1 million. That's at 9%. So if you're already there, you are already in the top 10%. Okay. And most of these businesses stay under seven figures because they never quite figure out how to scale profitably, right? They stay a business of one, they stay a business of maybe 5 employees, but they can't figure out how to scale their business properly, right? And that is the reason why so many businesses never get there, right? Because there is an art in order to be able to scale and scale properly, right? Because if you don't scale properly, eventually what happens is you run out of cash, right? And this is a question that I always get, especially as a profit first professional, is how do I scale on profit first, right? How do I scale on profit first? And how do I scale while continuing to reach my target percentage allocations? That's a question that I constantly get. And there's always this friction, right? There's always this friction between how do I stay in my target allocation percentages while still continue to progress in my business, right? Because we want to stay in those target allocation percentages once we meet that and scale. And you have all heard it, right? You've all heard it that it takes money in order to make money, right? It takes an investment in order to continue to grow your revenue and profits once you get to a certain point. And usually what I find is, up until that $500,000 mark, most businesses can run on word of mouth and reputation. But once they get to that above that $500,000 mark, really it takes some type of advertising or investment to really get to that next level. And I like to think about it as that tension, right? There's a tension between risk versus the potential for reward, right? There's always that balancing act that you have to do, because with any type of investment that you have to make, right, there's always a bit of the unknown in terms of how things will turn out. And so really, it's about really balancing that investment versus that reward. And for you guys that are already employers, your team, your employees, that's going to be your biggest investment, right? When I look at your profit and loss statements, usually it's that payroll number that is your highest expense. So one of the things that I'm going to recommend before you ever go out and hire another person, right? I'm going to recommend that you optimize your processes before hiring. So optimize your process before hiring, because hiring should be your last resort, right? Hiring should be the last resort, because whenever you add people to the mix, right? People are people-ish. I love my brother. He tells me that hiring people is a lot like hoarding cats, right? You never know what they're going to do next. They have all sorts of different things that happen. We want to make sure that really hiring is our last resort, meaning that the first thing we want to do is make sure that our systems are optimized, right? We want to optimize our systems so that we don't need as many people, right? In fact, I recommend, optimizing your process before hiring, because hiring is your last resort, right? Because people are complicated. You never know what they're going to do. There's an emotional factor with it. There's a lot of complications when managing people. So one of the biggest expenses that we're going to see on your profit and loss statement, it's going to be your team, right? It's going to be your team. That's going to be your biggest investment. So if you can implement a process or a system that reduces your reliance on people, I recommend you do that before you hire. So optimize your processes so that you require less human resources, right? And I see this a lot in our grocery store industry, right? Who know that one day we'll be able to go to the grocery store and check out, right? And not be able to interact with a person. Who knew that we could just do a self checkout, right? But literally what's happened in the grocery store industry is they have reduced their reliance on people. By now you can check out your own stuff. If you go to Sam's Club, you can actually use an app to actually do your shopping so that you just scan your phone at the checkout line, right? So they've automated their processors in order to reduce their reliance on people because people are, peopleish, right? That you never know what's going to happen. Prices are always going up. Rates are always going up. Wages are always going up. And so if you can optimize those processes to not rely on people first, that is one of the best things that you can do. And I'm always amazed by how much one can discover, right? Simply by sitting down and observing processes, right? Observing processes and mapping those out. One of the things that I used to do as part of my job, I used to work for Arthur Andersen, was I would literally sit down with my clients and I would observe their processes. Literally, I would go into a department and I would start with the lowest entry level person and I would observe all the way up through the management levels. And what happened was I would observe their process. I would document their process. I would write these processes down and I would map those processes, right? And I would use a software like Microsoft Visio in order to flow chart those processes. And what I was looking for was I was looking for redundant steps or unnecessary steps in the process. And I'll tell you this saved Andersen's clients thousands of dollars just from sitting down and watching the processes every single year, evaluating those processes and looking at things that we can cut, duplications, just amazing things, just by sitting down and watching those processes. Another thing is performing those time studies, right? Those time studies in your company, looking at what is billable time versus unbillable time, right? How are your people spending their time, right? Because there are efficiencies that can be gained by really reducing that unbillable time, right? And giving those persons that have high unchargeable time or a high unbillable time, billable work. Because what you might find as you're observing process or looking at time studies is not everybody is being fully utilized, right? Not everybody is fully chargeable. Not everybody is billable, right? And maybe somebody in your company has too much time on their hands, right? Maybe they're not being fully gossiped or fully utilized. One of the things that I would do is, I would walk into my office and I would listen to that water cooler chatter, right? I would listen for water cooler chatter. I would listen for that idle chat because if I heard a lot of chatting happening from one person, I knew that person probably had a little bit too much time on their hands, right? I knew they had a little bit too much time on their hands if I was constantly hearing office gossip, right? And so maybe what could happen is starting to shift that load where you've got somebody that has a lot of billable time, right? A lot of usage, maybe shifting some extra work or new work that comes into the person that's non-billable, right? And you can definitely identify these opportunities through job costing, right? Looking at your job costing studies, looking at your time studies, right? If you guys are using T-sheets to really see, which employees are more billable versus not billable. Also looking at which employees are more efficient, right? Because what you're going to find is when you're looking at time studies, you're going to have employees that are some employees are going to be more efficient than other employees, right? And so, definitely, what are some things that we can take away from those employees that are more efficient that they can maybe share those best practices with those that are not, right? In order to increase the efficiency of the overall team, right? So being able to share those best practices with the efficient employees versus the non-efficient employees in order to really increase our utilization and increase our efficiencies before we ever hire another person. And like I said, one of the things that we did was we used a tool called Microsoft Visio, right? And Microsoft Visio is a flow charting software. And what I would do is I would observe processes, right? I would observe processes and I would flow chart those processes out from every single level of the team. And again, I'm looking for redundant tasks. I'm looking for things that maybe, somebody is doing an extra step that doesn't need to happen. And you're not going to identify those unless you observe that process. And I'm looking for steps that just really don't add value, right? Things that don't add value. And I want to remove those processes from my operations, right? And perhaps even systematizing further through automation, right? If you implement automation, you're going to reduce the need for a new employee. Like we talked about in the grocery store aisles, they now have you check out yourself and they're implementing automation to reduce the need for additional people. So overall, finding ways to automate a process or remove unnecessary steps are going to add margins to your bottom line without increasing your expenses, right? So definitely looking for efficiencies, looking at unbillable time, and really looking for opportunities to automate. Those are going to be some of the first things that I explore before I ever start to add headcount to my operations. So definitely let's explore these operations first. Now, how many of you out there, how many of you guys are actually conducting process interviews annually? So every year in order to discover efficiencies. So sometimes just taking that extra step will add tremendous value to your operations. So let's say it's time to hire, right? Let's say it's time to hire. We can't put this off anymore, right? We're being squeezed in every direction. We feel like we can't grow, right? Because we really need to have more hands. So let's say we're at that point. We've automated, we've observed our processes. We made things more efficient. Let's say there's no other option. We have to hire, right? We can't put it off anymore because if we continue to put off hiring, we're not going to be able to scale and we're not going to be able to grow. So let's talk about what we need to do, right? First of all, before I even hire, right? Before I even hire, I sit back and I go, who? Who is the who that I am going to hire, right? Who is going to have the biggest impact in my organization by bringing that person on, right? And it's interesting because I meet so many business owners who think that, when they think of hiring, they think, I'm going to hire that entry level position, right? So many business owners think, my first hire, my first few hires, it's going to be that entry level position. And this is a common thought because, this is really interesting because there is a saying out there, there is a thought out there in the business world that you hire for attitude versus aptitude. That is a common thought out there. And while it's true in some cases, I'm going to actually challenge that notion. I'm going to challenge that notion of hiring for attitude versus aptitude. Okay. Now there are times that you want to do this, right? But not always, right? And I'm going to tell you this, that it really depends on the situation and it depends on your strategy, right? Because if you're a scaling business, maybe you don't want to be the smartest one in the room constantly, right? Maybe you don't want to be feeding baby birds constantly, right? That thought leadership is going to become very important for you in a scaling organization. So if you are wanting to be a team of more than a party of one, you're going to need thought leaders around you, right? And your team. And these business owners that think about, I'm going to hire entry level, right? They're thinking about hiring entry level because one, there's a cost benefit, right? They think that it's going to cost me less if I hire somebody that's brand new, right? Because I can hire more of them or have more hands. And these business owners, they hire entry level because they think that, I can train this person to eventually do the job. And maybe if they stay long enough, I can promote them into the manager position. And in the meantime, it's going to save costs. That's typically the thinking by hiring a whole bunch of entry level people, right? But it's interesting because according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, the average employee only stays at a job for just 4 years. That's how long an average employee stays at a company, right? No matter who you are, 4 years is the average time that people stay with a company. And so what this means is that statistically, once an employee gets really good, right? Because you trained them, because you hired entry level, you poured your love out into them, you've mentored them, you made them into a great employee, right? Once you poured all your love and all your training into them, and so what that means statistically is an employee gets really good, right? And that means they're ready to supervise. Statistically, that means they're already looking out the door for a better opportunity outside your company, right? And I don't care how great your company is, right? Statistically, most employees only stay for an average of 4 years. Okay. So that means that by the time you've invested and you've made that employee everything that you want, they are ready to go. Okay. Statistically. And that's what happens. And again, the statistics point out, only 9% of companies ever make it to $1 million in revenue. So these statistics are playing out in reality. Now, sometimes an employee can stay their full career with you, right? That happens, right? And that's a real blessing when that happens. But statistically, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is telling us that the reality is that most employees are not going to stay with you their entire career, right? They're going to stay with you for 4 years. And realistically, how it typically plays out in a small business or any business, right, is that most businesses will struggle to scale simply because the owner ends up doing too much, right? The owner is pulled in a million different directions and he's doing too much. And so he can't scale, right? Because that means that the owner now is caught up in the cycling of hiring, right? And training these new employees, these inexperienced employees. And therefore, what happens is the owner is unable to really move into that next phase of his business because he doesn't have time to move into those areas that allow him to grow and scale his business. Okay. Because he's too busy in that cycle of churning and burning new employees and training them because they leave after 4 years, right? No matter how experienced they are, they're leaving within 4 years. So he's never able to scale. Now, I'm going to challenge you for just a moment. I'm going to challenge you. Okay. Imagine what would happen if you hire to replace yourself at every single level, meaning that once you have mastered a process or a skill set, right, you're immediately looking for your replacement so that you can promote yourself to a new level. Imagine you're looking for your replacement after you've mastered a skill set or a process in order to replace yourself. So imagine if you hired an experienced A-level manager for your operations. Imagine if you hired an experienced A-level manager for every single area of your operations, because no one's going to be able to do everything that you do. But let's say you hire someone specifically for every single area of your operations. Let's say this manager, right? This person that you hire, and they stay with you an average of 4 years because they are experienced, right? Because they're experienced. And this manager, if you hire someone that's experienced, that has actually managed people, right? This person can provide you with the bandwidth, right? Once they learn the process so that you are free to expand your business, right? So you're not just teaching them, how to show up for work, how to be professional. This person has already brought in some level of experience with managing people. Now, if this person is an A-level manager, right? Once they are caught up to speed, right? And if they're experienced, it's not going to take as much time, which should be quicker, right? Than hiring an entry-level person because they've already done similar work. This manager should be able to train and supervise your staff while giving you the bandwidth to focus on other efforts. So that, again, that who becomes really important, right? And so definitely consider hiring experienced level employees who are going to be able to produce higher level productivity for you in a shorter period of time. And this person's going to allow you to be able to focus on other matters that are related to scaling your business. So consider doing that. Maybe it's more expensive, but maybe that trade in productivity and that bandwidth that it's going to give you will allow you to grow and scale your business much better than having a bunch of newbies underneath you, right? So definitely consider hiring an experienced person as your next hire. Maybe that should be the who. And this way, you're going to create an environment where the team no longer depends on you, right? Because if you have that A-level manager that can train and supervise, you're now creating a team that no longer relies on you. Because I know most of you guys have team out there, but really it's being able to have a team not be dependent on you is really what's holding you back. So creating that environment where the team no longer depends on you is going to be important. So now let's talk ratios. And because in Profit First, we have ratios, right? We have ratios. And what we expect to have in terms of ratio, we expect that every employee on average should be generating $150,000 in real revenue, right? So our expectation in Profit First is that every employee that you have should at least be generating $150,000 in real revenue. And so what that means is that for every $150,000 in real revenue, right, you should have one employee, right? And when you have a business that has higher cost labor, right, such as physicians or lawyers or engineers, right, we actually want to see a 4X on that. We want to see a 4X because $150,000 may not be enough to support them. So if you've got a $100,000 salary position, I'd like to see that person generate $400,000 in real revenue, right? And a manager can definitely do that for you. And I like the 4X because where I have found in order to achieve your target allocation percentages, when you've got a 4X return, you're going to be able to hit that sweet spot in terms of your target allocation percentages. So one of the questions that I always get in Profit First is that the closer you get to that 4X, right? That 4X or that 150,000, it starts to feel tight, right? It starts to feel tight in the fulfillment of your product or service. And it's interesting because what you're going to find in Profit First is that the closer that you're getting to reaching that spot, right, where you're truly optimized in terms of numbers, your team starts to feel a little bit more agitated, right, at taking on more work. There's an atmosphere of agitation, like, oh my gosh, she's giving me one more assignment, right? And they're starting to feel like they're at capacity, right? And they're starting to feel like, oh my goodness, no more overtime, right? And they're starting to feel like if you add one more thing to my pile, right, that pile might just end up on the floor, right? And one of the things that I like to do is I like to anticipate the need. And what that has looked like for me is the longer that timeline between starting the search for that ideal team player before I needed them yesterday, right? The better off I am. So really creating that bandwidth between when I need that person versus when I'm going to make that hire, right? Is very, very important. Making sure that there's enough space in that time. Because who has ever been in a position where you're trying to fill a role that you needed the person yesterday? Who has ever been in that position where you felt like, oh my gosh, I needed that person yesterday and I'm hiring? And it is definitely not a fun place to be in. It's definitely not a fun place to be in where you needed somebody yesterday. In fact, usually when I'm hiring for somebody that I needed yesterday, there's usually that feeling of desperation that starts to creep in, right? In that hiring process. That's when we start to feel that interview fatigue. We start feeling like, oh my goodness, there are no good employees out there. And unfortunately, that's that space where we start to make decisions that are not in the best interest of the company, right? Because we're feeling like there's no talent out there. We're desperate, right? And I've heard this over and over again, people saying that, right? And that's because they're not giving themselves enough bandwidth in order to really be able to hire. So the longer the bandwidth that you're going to give yourself in terms of starting that search and actually being able to give yourself that time in order to fill that position, right, the better off you're going to be. All right. Now, for us, we find that it usually takes about 3 months to find an A player entry level position. So about 3 months. And it usually takes about 6 months in order to find an A player manager level position, 6 months. And the reason why it takes a little bit longer on the manager position is, because this is the time that we're going to need to find them, because we're not only looking for a specified skill set, right? We're also looking for a role fit too, right? We're looking for someone in a manager position currently that can be an example for our team, right? We're looking for someone that our team members can emulate, right? Someone that they can look up to that not only just has a skill set, but also has the work ethic and has the same values that we want, right? We're looking for a role model. And so we want to spend a little bit more time up front in order to identify that person, because it is such a critical role for us. And so again, we're looking for someone that fits our culture of our firm, because we found that when you're not a culture fit, it usually doesn't work out, right? If you don't have the same work ethic, the same values, it doesn't work out. And so we're looking for something called shared immutable laws or values, because in the long run, this person's going to be more happy and they're going to fit in better if it's a fit from an immutable law standpoint and value standpoint, right? So to project this level of growth, right, for us to predict this level of growth, and the need for people to join our team, we are monitoring our real revenue growth. Okay. So we're constantly monitoring this real revenue growth, and we're looking at trends. We're looking at trends such as an increase in client load, increase in sales is what we're looking at. But we're also considering our own outgoing efforts, right? Such as our marketing campaigns that we're implementing, that's going to generate this level of growth, right? Because we believe that we can control our level of growth, right? We can control our revenue growth through our marketing strategy, is what we believe. And I know at our firm, our growth is not erratic, right? We control that through our marketing strategy and our client intake process. And what that means is we can actually predict how much time it's going to take for us to have this person fully generating their share of real revenue. Okay, we can actually predict this number. It's not some erratic thing. We actually can predict our growth. And also what can happen too is that we're considering how much time it takes for us to produce that level of real revenue. So in effect, what happens is we're putting together a strategy in order to not only cover our employees' costs, but also to generate the growth in real revenue that's needed in order to achieve that target allocation percentages. And I know, like I've shared with you guys before, that we calculate something called the cost of client acquisition based upon our marketing efforts. Okay. And we know that it takes about $1,500 to acquire a new client based upon our launch strategy. We use a launch strategy where we know that if we spend $1,500 in advertising spend, it will generate one client. And so if the annual revenue associated with a new client is approximately $15,000 in a year, if that's the annual revenue associated with a new client, we know that we have to produce 13 new clients in order to fill a $50,000 position at 4 times its cost. So we're backwardsly using our algebra to figure that out. And so we're projecting an overall advertising spend of $19,500 in order to generate those 13 clients in order to achieve that target revenue. So we've backwardly, algebraically figured how much do we need to spend in our marketing strategy in order to generate that amount of clients. And so really, it's a very much controlled process. Now, there's some other things that we do need to consider also. Like we have to consider, based upon our current team, how many clients do we want to onboard at one particular time? So if we're introducing a new strategy or a new program, we don't want to open the gates and have a lot of people join, right? We want to test our strategy. We want to test our new program before we allow us to do that. So if we want to say we want to bring somebody on in 6 months, right? We know that we need to have 2 to 3 launches at an advertising spend of $19,500 in order to reach that target allocation goal, right? We know that we need to do that in order to bring on a new employee in order to cover that cost. Now, there is a point when you're building your business where you may experience, not having enough internal resources to fulfill that order, right? So let's say you're growing and it just happens to be growing at a quicker rate, but you're at this uncomfortable spot where you don't have the internal resources right now in order to fill those current orders, right? Because nobody wants to continue to sell if you can't service, right? So one of the things that I would encourage you to consider is what we call a phase-in approach. And what happens in a phase-in approach is you'll bring an employee in on a part-time scaled back basis, right? Maybe during the summer months when things are not so busy, where there's not a need to be full-time, where they may not even want to be full-time, right? And what happens is you're transitioning them slowly to a full-time basis based upon the marketing and sales that's required to be acquired in order to bring them full time. So you're literally increasing their number of hours in order to bring them in, right? So as your sales increase and your real revenue increases, the number of hours that this new employee can take on also increases, right? And so that phase-in approach works really well. Another thing that you can do is as sales increases is also start to put away the excess money in your OPEX account, right? Because you've got the sales. And what can happen then is if there's excess OPEX, right? Because your sales are going up, right? Because there's a 4X on that, is to start another bank account called a new employee hold account, which is a subset of the OPEX account. And you're going to continue to build this new employee hold account until you have about 3 to 6 months of the salary saved in this account. And then once you've got 3 to 6 months of salary that you've got saved into this account, you now have a buffer, right? You have this buffer now for your new hire while you implement this revenue growth strategy, which is going to help you achieve your target allocation percentages, right? To be able to support that employee financially. You've got a bit of a buffer there, right? That you've been able to save. And again, thank you guys for joining me. I love spending the afternoon with you. And until next time, may the profits be with you.